A variety of events occurred in the fields of politics, economy, and society throughout the world this year. On this episode of The Point World Affairs, we picked some key events that shook the world in 2018. On June 12, the leaders of North Korea and the United States met for the first time in Singapore after 68 years of hostility. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un took the first historic step towards the establishment of a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula by engaging in the meeting of the century to seek denuclearization and regime preservation. The U.S.-China trade war that launched on March 22nd also took a toll on the global economy. The world's two largest economies agreed to a 90-day halt in trade dispute early December, but it remains uncertain whether the dispute will actually be settled. In terms of domestic issues within the U.S., the migrant caravan issue has become a recurrent problem. The biggest controversy lies in the dilemma between the Trump administration that has firmly been taking a hardline approach in stopping illegal immigrants from entering the country and the prosecuted migrants in search of a new life in the U.S. Jamal Khashoggi was perhaps one of the most commonly mentioned figures this year. The dissident journalist who has openly criticized the Saudi royal family caused a stir in the international community when it was confirmed that he was murdered in October after visiting the Saudi consulate in Turkey. News of natural disasters, particularly in Indonesia, also caused quite a stir. After losing more than 500 people from an earthquake in July, Indonesia saw another earthquake and tsunami that took over 2,000 lives in September. And now, just 3 months later, another tsunami slammed into the Java and Sumatra islands that killed hundreds more. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we take a look at the events that rocked 2018 and discuss their future developments in the year to come.
Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Cha Sang-mi. Today at our end-of-year special, we look through major events that defined 2018 as well as the outlook for next year. For that, we have with us Dr. Ryu Yong-ok, professor at National University of Singapore, also a research fellow at Yonsei University's Institute for North Korean Studies. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Professor, what do you think was the most noteworthy global issue of this year?
This year has had a number of interesting issues. If I had to pick one, I would choose a set of events relating to the Korean Peninsula, namely the 3 inter-Korean summits and the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore. And I choose these events because they are significant for the future of the Korean Peninsula, but also they're also significant for the general regional peace and stability, because these events suggested maybe North Korea under the new leader Kim Jong-un was serious and ready for a new change and a new relationship with the outside world.
Right, so these 3 consecutive inter-Korean summits that started in April 27th, and then it was after a month that it took place in Panmunjom again, and then another one was in Pyongyang for 2 days, right? So we were actually keeping close tabs on all of these developments. But what were some of the most moving scenes or inspirational scenes that you recall?
There were a couple of scenes which had a lasting impression on me. The first one was from the first summit, when Kim Jong-un set foot on South Korean soil for the first time, making him the first North Korean leader ever to do so since the Korean War. And then the two leaders held hands and crossed the DMZ border together, which is also the first time that has ever happened. The other memorable scene, in my opinion, was from the Pyongyang summit, when the two leaders visited Mount Baekdu. As you know, Mount Baekdu is revered as a sacred mountain both in South Korea and in North Korea, and stands as the symbol of Korean unity as well as Korean great power status. So it was highly symbolic that these two leaders visited the mountain together, signifying the future of Korean unity and greatness.
Right, you also mentioned about the Washington-Pyongyang summit, which was also rendered very historic, that took place in Singapore. Even though that there was this historic event, there were very stalled talks on denuclearization. So what do you think is the reason behind that?
Right, so I think the Singapore summit between Trump and Kim was historic without much real significance. And because the document that these two leaders signed was too short, too ambiguous, and almost contained a seed of its own destruction. So the US side believed that North Korea was genuinely interested in denuclearization, and so demanded North Korea to take steps towards denuclearization first before US lifts sanctions on Pyongyang. On the other hand, North Korea believed that the two countries had to begin, they called mutual confidence building measures, which included lifting of some of the economic sanctions on Pyongyang before North Korea takes steps towards denuclearization. So the two countries do not see each other eye to eye. As a result, the progress on denuclearization issue has not made much progress so far. That's why the process on denuclearization and developing the US-North Korea relationship has been stalled.
Right, and President Trump and his officials a few times mentioned that their second meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will be in the beginning of next year. So when do you think this possible meeting will take place, and where and what kind of agenda do you think they will be discussing?
Right, so I think there's the possibility that the next summit will take place next year, right? Although the timeline will not be according to what has been suggested. So I actually expect the next summit will take place later than what most people expect. So it could be after February. And that's because North Korea is not interested in the second summit at this stage. And the United States has too many issues on its plate to deal with. So both countries are pressed with other issues. So they are not so much interested in the second summit at this moment. But I still believe that USA will give another chance to diplomacy, which means that the summit will take place next year. In terms of the place of the next summit, it probably will not be Singapore. So after the first summit in Singapore, there were domestic political backlash in Singapore against holding such summit, spending Singaporean taxpayers' money. My bet is that it will be either in Mongolia, or Switzerland, or in Indonesia. So these are the countries that maintain fairly good relations with North Korea, or they are neutral countries when it comes to the relationship between USA and North Korea. So either one of these three countries are fairly good candidates for the second summit.
Some commentators say that while North Korea was a priority for the U.S. Foreign policy, perhaps, maybe China's trade war that they have been engaging with, that was in the economic side, the priority. What do you think about that, and how serious is this, and who do you think is the winner for now?
Right, so North Korea is an immediate concern for the USA. China is more of a long-term concern for the USA. So to that extent, it's a bigger issue for the Trump administration. Now, there are no economic winners, right, in any type of trade war. So the USA and China both lost quite a bit economically, although China probably lost more than the USA. As you know, the trade deficit for the USA, right, vis-a-vis China, hit a record high of about $375 billion last year. So whenever tariffs get bumped up, right, China stands to lose way more than the United States. If you ask a different question, that is, who was political winner or loser in this trade war, I think so far the Trump administration has been winning politically, because President Xi Jinping has given in to some extent to American pressure. Although things could change, right, depending upon the domestic political and economic situations in both countries. So we probably need to wait and see as to who will become the final political winner out of this trade war.
Okay, let's hear what another expert says about that. For more on that, we connect to another expert on trade. Joining me now is Professor Joseph Chang from the City University of Hong Kong. Good to see you again, Professor.
Thank you very much.
The arrest of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou became a diplomatic issue between the U.S. and China. How do you think this will affect a temporary halt in the U.S.-China trade dispute?
It is much speculated that the American intelligence authorities have been collecting information on Chinese corporations violating the law. And there are many cases, probably, in waiting. And the Huawei case is probably one of those cases. Hence, if the negotiations between the two countries go on smoothly, then this Huawei case, probably will become insignificant. But if agreement cannot be reached, then there may probably be more exposure of similar cases. Already, the Wall Street Journal has hinted that the American government revealed cases of internet hacking originating from China.
The global economy suffered in 2018 because of this tariff war between the two superpowers. Do you think this situation will improve in 2019?
The present trade war between the United States and China are more than just a matter of trade deficits and trade surpluses. It is likely to be a kind of competition for superiority in the economic as well as scientific and technological fields. And this competition is likely to be long-term and structural. It is entirely possible, though, that the two countries may well reach an agreement, avoiding all-out trade war at this stage. But the competition will remain, and the United States will probably go on exerting pressure on China, not only in the trade fields, but also in the security and diplomatic fields as well.
Thank you. That was Professor Joseph Chang from Hong Kong. Professor, do you want to add to Professor Chang's analysis? Also, recently, U.S. and China reached a ceasefire on this temporary 90-day window on this trade war. Do you think things will ease down? What do you think?
So the trade war the Trump administration initiated with China is basically holding the world economy to its attempt to pressure China to make economic concessions, right? And as I said, there are no economic winners, right, out of this trade war. Hence, the resolution to the trade war would mean good things for the world economy. But as you mentioned, that it's only temporary at this stage. And we have to see what comes out of the 90-day negotiation period. If the two sides cannot reach a compromise, then we could even see a more serious trade war between the two. But my prediction is that the two sides will probably reach some compromise because Trump initiated this trade war not to destroy the Chinese economy, but to gain economically for the United States. So the real issue is not whether or not these two countries will compromise, but on what issues to compromise and to what extent.
Controversy also was an immigration issue, especially in the U.S., where President Trump has been pushing for this hardline stance on this immigration since his campaigning days. So we have this migrant caravans arriving at the U.S.-Mexican border right now. So how serious is this? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so this is a fairly serious domestic issue in the USA. So thousands of migrant caravans arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border from Central American countries. And I think Trump should blame himself for this problem to some extent. So for many of these potential migrants, it's now or never situation if they want to enter into the United States because Trump has threatened to close down the border with Mexico. And as a result, as I said, thousands of migrant caravans has arrived at the border, and it has created a host of diplomatic issues with Mexico, domestic political problems in the USA, as well as human rights issues. Right? So the Trump administration, as we know, right, shut down the government over the issue of building a wall right, at the border with Mexico, and which has also created diplomatic problems with Mexico. And some of these migrants that have arrived at the border suffer from basic human needs, so which has created human rights problems.
Okay, let's hear more from the local expert. We connect to another expert on the issue. Joining me now is Professor Van Tran from Columbia University. We really appreciate you being here with us, Professor.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
The news surrounding the migrant caravans have become a controversial issue broadcasted around the world. Is the U.S. government still firm on its border policy?
I think we are, unfortunately, under the current administration because there has been a lot of discussion, especially led by our President Trump, about being very tough with the border. And what we have seen over the last 6 weeks is the fact that we are very, very much doing everything we can to stop migrants from coming, from using tear gas, but also strengthening the border to the south.
There's a dilemma between the Central American migrants who want to enter and who are seeking asylum in the U.S., whereas the President Trump are actually saying that they cannot afford to have the immigrants enter the country. So what do you think is the fundamental way to resolve this issue?
I think there is a way, and that is really the current asylum policy in the U.S. Under the current law, everyone who tried to cross into the U.S. soil has the right and is entitled to a hearing so that their case can be heard, especially if they want to apply for asylum status. And that is one of the loopholes that the current administration is trying to close by changing the asylum law. And that, I think, is fundamentally inhumane because this is part of a global flow of migrants, and we have always opened our doors to those who are trying to flee persecution from their home country. And in this particular case, when you look at the 6,000 to 8,000 people who have been traveling across thousands of miles to be to the U.S., we see that many of them were fleeing violence and persecution in the home country, especially those who are coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and to some extent El Salvador. So I think if we continue to hold tight to our asylum policy, then we can allow the process to unfold in a peaceful manner, which is fair both to the migrants but also to the spirit of our policy. And that seems to not be happening as quickly as we should be doing.
Thank you. That was Professor Van Tran from Columbia University. Professor, it is a global trend rather, not just confined to the U.S., this refugee or the immigrant issue. What do you think?
The issue of immigration has become #1 social issue in many of the developed countries, especially in the West. And it's a sensitive and difficult issue. So on the one hand, we should protect refugees and be open to economic migrants, which may be good for the domestic economy. On the other hand, a large influx of foreigners with different values could weaken the social fabric of the host nation and could create economic and social problems. Right? I think the key is to find a balance between the two, right? With a capable bureaucracy that could manage the transition towards a multi-ethnic and cultural society, as well as a sound social policy that creates a harmonious coexistence between the foreign settlers and the host nation once they are permitted to enter into the host nation's territory.
Aside from this migrant caravan, there was this name that's really stirred the world. It was Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist who was killed at a Saudi consulate in Turkey. Yes,
it was indeed a very serious issue, and it shocked the conscience of many people around the world, especially with the availability of the audio file that we could hear the last words of Khashoggi, right, that he couldn't breathe. It shocked the Western world, which generally maintains fairly good or amicable relations with the Saudi royal family, created diplomatic problems between the West and Saudi Arabia, which has not been fully resolved to date.
Right, okay, let's connect to an expert in Turkey to hear more about that. Joining us now is Muhsin Mughal, an executive producer at TRT World in Istanbul, who has been following up the horrific incident from day one. Welcome back, Muhsin. So how much progress has been made on the Turkey-led investigation of Jamal Khashoggi's death, and what are the findings so far?
Well, so far it's definitely been established that Jamal Khashoggi was brutally murdered inside the consulate. The investigations on this side, particularly from the Turkish side, are ongoing. Despite the authorities saying that there hasn't been much cooperation, rather no cooperation from the Saudi side. And recently there were calls for extradition of those Saudi citizens that Turkey finds involved in that murder, individuals who actually carried out the orders from wherever they came from. Turkey asked for those access to those individuals, but Saudi Arabia has denied that access, saying that well, we do not extradite our own citizens, no matter what they are involved in. In a sense that the investigations are still on, and Turkey is trying to find as much as possible what exactly happened to the body as well. Maybe they have come to a conclusion and it's not public already. The fact is that Saudi Arabia has not been cooperating, which obviously the international community understands very well now. It has not been cooperating in any kind of investigations. Yes, they did send a couple of their representatives a couple of times to Istanbul and to Ankara to meet the authorities here, but nothing conclusive actually came from that side.
Right, Muhsin, and how has the world changed so far since the incident, and how do you think the world will change after this incident in 2019?
It's taken the world by surprise of how an individual, a journalist, can be a threat to a particular house in power. I think it's had its impact in the sense that it's laid bare the diplomatic overtures that other countries would have been making towards Saudi Arabia. A lot has stopped. It has had its impact on the situation in Yemen as well. It's brought back the focus of what Saudi Arabia-led coalition is doing. This kind of brought focus of on what Saudi Arabia is doing internationally. And has also brought in focus on what's going on in the country internally.
Thank you. That was Muhsin Mughal from TRT News. Now, Professor, it seems like there is a complex dynamics between the U.S. and the Middle East. Especially, there were some comments made about Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. It seems like President Trump didn't want to go that far to that direction. Tell us about their intricate relationship.
I think beyond being a diplomatic issue, right, between the West and Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia, with which the Western countries maintain amicable relations, I think the incident highlights a number of interesting and important lessons, right, for us. The first one is the feeble nature of the freedom of media. Right? So the freedom of media is not guaranteed. It's something that we need to fight for, right, in order to enjoy it. Another lesson out of this Khashoggi incident is the importance of public opinion, right, in foreign relations, especially in democratic countries. As you know, Saudi Arabia is not a democratic country, and perhaps because of that, the royal family neglected the important role the public opinion plays in Western democratic countries, and as a result finds itself in a difficult political situation vis-a-vis the Western countries.
Okay, and now this time a little more towards the natural disasters that has been worrying us throughout this year. Really, we have seen so many torrential rain. We've been seeing tsunamis, earthquakes really around the world, but especially in Indonesia in particular. We have seen so many deaths and casualties that's happening. Please tell us, why is this happening particularly in Indonesia?
Right, so Indonesia sits on the so-called Ring of Fire, which is an area in the basin of the Pacific Ocean where many earthquakes and volcanic eruptions take place. And Indonesia is one of those countries that sit on this ring of fire. The recent tsunami, right, which has killed hundreds of people in Indonesia, is also said to have been caused by a volcanic eruption in a nearby mountain, which has caused landslides and which set off the tsunami reactions. In Indonesia, right, this year, there have also been a number of other natural disasters. So in July, there was a Lombok earthquake, and in September, there was a Sulawesi earthquake and tsunami, which has also killed hundreds of people. You know, I think human beings are powerless, right, when Mother Nature gets angry. And the only thing that we can do is to prepare well, right, before these natural disasters hit, so as to minimize human casualties and suffering.
Right, we send our deepest condolences to Indonesia. Meanwhile, we go back to the first set of questions where we began on the developments of the Korean Peninsula. How do you prospect the 2019 to be on the Korean Peninsula?
In my opinion, what North Korea is genuinely interested in is not denuclearization, but disarmament. Right? Therefore, the North Korea wants to engage in the process of reducing its nuclear warheads vis-a-vis the United States, even though its intention is not to get rid of all the nuclear materials. So as a result, I think progress on denuclearization issue will also face some difficulty next year, which will negatively affect all other foreign relations between North Korea and the USA, as well as the inter-Korean relations.
Okay, it seems like it's going to be a busy year again next year. Okay, thank you very much for coming today.
My pleasure.
Looking back on what happened around the world in 2018, there were many events that both angered and saddened us, yet also many moving and inspirational stories that gave us hope. We hope this coming year we'll be able to bring you with more insightful and relevant news around the world. That's all we have for the end of year special of The Point World Affairs. Thank you for tuning in and Happy New Year's.